Dr. Kalambokidis is Minnesota's state economist, and I spoke with her this week for a better understanding of the underlying trends driving the February forecast and the anticipated economic recovery. In November, the state was looking at a projected deficit of $1.3 billion. Now we've got a projected surplus of $1.6 billion. Why, over the course of 3 months, has there been such a shift?
Thanks for having me here today, and I'm happy to talk about that forecast change. So there are two things that happened. One is that projected revenues are significantly higher than they had been projected in the November forecast, and also that projected spending is lower than what had been expected before. So on the revenue side, two things happened. One, which normally would have been a pretty big factor, but is overshadowed by the second factor. And the first one is that our actual revenues that we've taken in the course of the few months since the last forecast have been higher than what we had forecast. And so that means that it makes sense that the forecast might be increased. But the main reason is that the US economic outlook changed dramatically between November and February. We start with a U.S. economic outlook, and then we build our Minnesota economic outlook from that. And so what's happening in the U.S. affects what's happening in Minnesota. And in November, the U.S. macroeconomic forecasting firm that we use did not include any impacts of any prospective federal fiscal pandemic relief payments. And since then, we've had the $900 billion bill that passed at the end of 2020, and we now have incorporated into the U.S. outlook the expectation of $1.5 trillion more of federal pandemic relief that is expected to pass this month and is expected to start influencing the economic growth this quarter. And so it is a large forecast swing for us in terms of revenues from November to February, but we don't usually see such dramatic changes in federal fiscal policy between November and February.
To that point, the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, Neel Kashkari, has been a proponent of federal stimulus to get the state and the nation through the pandemic. The recovery after the Great Recession was slow. Experts are saying this could be a much faster recovery. Have economists learned some lessons from that recovery versus this and fiscal stimulus at the federal level?
Yeah, I think that economists have learned some things and policymakers have learned some things. So there were some economists during the course of the last recovery from the previous recession who were calling for more stimulus, but there didn't seem to be as much of an appetite for it among the members of Congress who were making decisions about that. But the Fed and economists elsewhere, economists in the Fed and economists elsewhere, have looked at that long stretch. It was a 10-year long, a record long economic expansion with fairly steady but relatively low growth and low inflation. And so the change in the way we look at this is that when you have slack in the labor market, meaning potentially you have people not only who are unemployed, but also a group of people who may be on the bench, so not in the labor market, that you can infuse money into the economy, stimulate the economy maybe more than expected, and not trigger much inflation because you still have to pull people into the labor market. And so the Fed is now given guidance where they're saying that they will allow, they're looking at targets for inflation that they're saying, let inflation stay at or near our target for a sustained amount of time before we'll try to ratchet things back, because we think that there are people on the bench. We think we can bring people into the labor market, and that may be better overall because it will spread that economic opportunity deeper into the labor market.
Many experts have spoken of the uneven nature of the recovery, some calling it K-shaped. Some businesses have thrived, but others, especially in leisure and hospitality, have been devastated. Is it up to policymakers to try to make those devastated industries whole? And what happens if they don't?
Yeah, it's when something happens in the economy that is uniquely affects one particular sector, it's reasonable for policymakers to look to try to support that sector. I mean, this wasn't a sector that lost jobs because of something that those businesses did wrong, or they didn't anticipate a change in technology, or they misinvested or overinvested. It was something that happened because of a pandemic that in order to protect the rest of the population, governors around the state restricted activity in those industries. And so I do see why policymakers are eager to support industries that were forced to restrict their businesses in order to protect other people.
Relatedly, there are about 100,000 fewer jobs in Minnesota than in February of last year. There are there are 100,000 fewer Minnesotans who are working now, and 250,000 fewer jobs than February of last year. We used to talk about a labor crunch. How does this affect the future? What has the pandemic done to our workers and our jobs?
Yeah, and it's 100,000 fewer people in the labor force now than last year, and 248,000 fewer jobs. So the initial condition that we started with before the pandemic hit was that Minnesota has an aging workforce and our labor supply was restricted. There have been in the last few years restrictions on international immigration, which had been an important source of new workers in Minnesota. So then the pandemic hit, and that overshadows all of those issues that we had before. We also had economic disparities, and those things didn't change, and those things aren't gone. And when the dust settles from the pandemic, those issues will arise again. So for now, we don't have a tight labor market. We don't have a restricted supply. We have instead, as you said, people who have left the labor force and people who are unemployed and looking for work. So as the economy grows, and it is expected to recover quickly, as the economy recovers, those people are going to be drawn into the labor market, and we will be back to a situation where, okay, now we have an aging population, we have baby boomers who are retiring. What do we do with that situation? The pandemic and the economic downturn are disrupting a lot of aspects of the economy. Things are very different right now than they were a year ago. We don't know exactly how those disruptions are going to play out. So we don't know what all the issues that we'll have to deal with when the economy fully recovers. But we do know that some of those initial conditions are still going to be there.
What about farmers? Last time we talked, farm income was up due in part to direct government payments. So how will the agricultural economy fare as we go forward, do you think?
Yeah, farmer income last time we talked had increased largely because of those big economic payments that were provided last year. And the coming reports are saying that the next set of farm income data is going to show a decline in farm income from that level that was boosted by farm payments. And the change, the decline in farm income is because there's less of those farm payments from the government occurring. Farmers dealt with a lot over the course of 2020. They dealt with supply chain disruptions from their inputs because of the pandemic. There was, if you remember a year ago, there was still significant trade policy uncertainty. Is China going to buy American soybeans? And some things have changed for the better over the course of 2020 for them. China is indeed buying American soybeans in order partly to rebuild their swine herds that were devastated by a swine flu there. In addition, we are seeing farmers that had their cash position improved by federal payments, they are finally, after a number of years of not doing so, they are finally investing in equipment and structures. And so we are seeing some improvement in that area.
Dr. Loehrke Kalambokidis, I love having you on to dig into this twice a year. I want to thank you for coming on today.
My pleasure.